Public understanding of constitutional law often hinges on dramatic signals such as vote counts, headlines, or simplified narratives about winners and losers. Yet the real work of the judiciary usually happens far from those surface impressions. In high-profile disputes, especially those involving constitutional rights, emergency court actions are frequently mistaken for final judgments. In reality, emergency orders are tools of timing and restraint rather than declarations of constitutional meaning. The Supreme Court's recent action concerning Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act illustrates this dynamic. The court declined to grant an emergency stay that would have lifted a lower court injunction, and that procedural choice was quickly framed as a decisive repudiation of the law itself. That interpretation assumes that a large numerical majority reflects substantive agreement on the merits. The procedural posture tells a different story. The court was asked to intervene before the normal appellate process had run its course, while a federal appeals court was still reviewing the case. In such circumstances, the justices apply a cautious standard that prioritizes stability and institutional discipline over immediate resolution. The denial of emergency relief did not determine whether the Missouri statute is constitutional, nor did it endorse the reasoning of the lower court. It simply allowed the existing injunction to remain in place temporarily. This distinction between procedural management and constitutional judgment is essential to understanding what actually occurred. Hold on to that distinction as the discussion continues, because it shapes how every subsequent argument should be evaluated. The Missouri law at issue was not drafted as a symbolic statement of political opposition, but as a detailed framework intended to alter how federal and state authorities interact on firearm regulation. The statute declared that certain federal gun restrictions exceeding the scope of the Second Amendment would be considered invalid within Missouri. More importantly, it prohibited state and local officials from assisting federal agencies in enforcing those disputed laws. This prohibition extended to the use of personnel, funding, facilities, and other resources. Supporters describe this approach as an application of the anti-commandeering doctrine, a principle derived from Supreme Court precedent stating that the federal government may not compel states to administer or enforce federal regulatory programs. The law went further by attaching financial penalties to violations. Instead of relying on state enforcement, it created a private right of action allowing individual citizens to sue officials who allegedly cooperated with federal enforcement. Each violation carried a substantial mandatory minimum penalty, along with legal costs. The design was intended to create a strong deterrent effect by shifting enforcement power away from the state and into private civil litigation. Critics argued that this structure did more than decline cooperation, and instead actively obstructed federal operations by punishing those who chose to assist. The federal government challenged the statute on that basis, asserting that it violated the Supremacy Clause by undermining federal law. A federal district court agreed and issued a broad injunction blocking the law from taking effect. Pause on that enforcement structure because it explains why the dispute centers not only on constitutional text, but also on how laws are operationalized in practice. The district court's injunction barred Missouri and its officials from enforcing the statute and attempted to extend that prohibition to private individuals as well. When the state sought relief from higher courts and ultimately asked the Supreme Court to lift the injunction on an emergency basis, the justices declined to do so. That decision left the injunction intact while appellate review proceeds. The most closely examined part of the Supreme Court's action, however, was not the unsigned order denying relief, but a separate statement joined by two justices. That statement focused narrowly on the scope of injunctions and the limits of judicial authority. It emphasized a foundational principle of civil procedure. A court order binds only the parties before the court. An injunction directed at a state and its officials does not automatically apply to private individuals who were not named as defendants and who are not acting as agents of the state. This observation did not validate the Missouri law or predict its ultimate fate. Instead, it clarified what the lower court's order legally covered. The implication, as presented in the statement, was that private citizens were not directly restrained by the injunction simply because they were not parties to the case. This clarification has been interpreted by some as leaving open the possibility that private enforcement actions could still be attempted, even while state officials remain barred from participation. Notice how this narrow procedural point carries significant practical implications without resolving any constitutional questions. It demonstrates how judicial reasoning can influence behavior indirectly by defining the reach of court orders rather than by issuing sweeping declarations. Keep that clarification in your mental framework because it illustrates how small procedural boundaries can shape larger legal conflicts. Another justice dissented from the denial of emergency relief, signaling a different view of how the court should have responded at this stage. That dissent suggested that the lower court's ruling warranted immediate intervention rather than deference to the normal appellate process. While the dissent did not change the outcome, it underscored that disagreement among the justices was less about the Second Amendment itself and more about timing, standards, and judicial role. The majority's choice to wait reflects a common pattern in emergency docket cases, where the court often prefers to let lower courts fully address complex issues before stepping in. This approach can frustrate observers who expect rapid clarity, but it reflects an institutional preference for deliberate review. As the case moves forward in the appellate court, the central legal question will likely focus on the boundary between permissible non-cooperation and unconstitutional interference. Missouri is expected to argue that it is merely declining to assist federal enforcement, an action it views as protected by existing doctrine. The federal government is expected to counter that imposing penalties for cooperation effectively obstructs federal law and exceeds what the anti-commandeering principle allows. Track this distinction carefully because it represents the core analytical issue the appellate court must resolve. The outcome will depend on how judges interpret the difference between refusal and punishment within the constitutional framework already established. The broader significance of this dispute lies not only in its immediate impact on gun regulation, but also in what it reveals about constitutional interpretation and judicial process. Constitutional meaning is not determined solely by text, nor by political alignment, but by how courts apply doctrines, standards, and procedural rules to specific factual arrangements. Reasonable interpreters can disagree about where established principles apply, especially when legislatures experiment with novel enforcement mechanisms. Emergency orders, concurring statements, and dissents all play distinct roles in that process, signaling concerns and constraints without delivering final answers. The current legal limbo illustrates how uncertainty itself can shape real-world behavior, even before courts resolve the merits. Local officials, federal agencies, and private individuals must navigate that uncertainty while higher courts deliberate. This episode serves as a reminder that constitutional law often advances incrementally through careful reasoning rather than dramatic pronouncements, understanding that slow, structured progression is essential for anyone seeking to interpret judicial actions responsibly. In the end, the most important takeaway is not who appears to be winning at any given moment, but how legal standards and procedural choices quietly guide the evolution of constitutional meaning.